Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death in the embrace of Mesmer's flame. With a hail of harpoons, with every last drop of my being! Fail the dread! You shall haunt me no longer! The pain. The exquisite pain.
There are some DLCs that make you forget the main game. After finishing the DLC, when you see images from the main game again or return to it, you realize how dated it feels. The last time I experienced this was with the DLCs for Dark Souls 3 and The Witcher 3. And now, I felt it again with Elden Ring. Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't feel like just a DLC. It feels more like Elden Ring 1.5, or even a sequel if we're exaggerating. This is because we interact with new mechanics, boss fights with entirely new movesets, get thrown into a completely different world, and embark on a unique adventure. The player agency in the main game was quite high, meaning we often encountered forks in the road, and each path led to a different adventure. Similarly, the DLC also presents us with many choices and different journeys. If a level design makes you think, how did I get here? How did I find my way through all this chaos? Then that is a great example of level design. Achieving this in a main game requires care and intelligence. Doing it in a DLC requires an additional level of dedication. It's this work ethic that has allowed Miyazaki to win the hearts of so many players. I never thought a DLC could offer as much agency as the main game. The last time I was this surprised was while playing The Witcher 3's DLCs, and I plan to make a good video about them as well. If Ubisoft had attempted to make Shadow of the Erdtree, they wouldn't have cared about the director or the vision. They would have focused solely on the profit and released it as a second game. But current-day Ubisoft could never make a game like this, because their concern for money is far greater than their concern for aesthetics. In fact, if Ubisoft had made this DLC, it wouldn't have been as impressive as the main game, because they would have focused on a small, dark corner of the lands between, rather than designing an entirely new open world for it. FromSoftware didn't just section off a corner of the lands between and say, let's add the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC here. As I mentioned earlier, they've created a whole new world, the Realm of Shadow, filled with unique bosses and stories. Whatever they did well in the previous game, they've done even better here. When we start the DLC, standing above the world beneath our feet, we can see more clearly what awaits us. The first area, Gravesite Plain, is vast, and the sheer scale and endless horizon can be dizzying. Should I go left or right? Will I reach that shattered giant tree only at the end of the game? So, I should avoid heading there as long as possible and sail off to other adventures. I wonder if I'll find a cave on the right, but it's not a mountainous area. Better to go left, where the chance of a cave seems higher. These are the kinds of thoughts that occupy us within the first minutes of the game. The abundance of options makes it clear that the adventure ahead will be deep. Once again, we start the game with a map whose full extent we can't predict. The map expands as we gather pieces, which isn't surprising because I already explained why the map is given in pieces instead of all at once while analyzing the main game. What did surprise me was that they designed such a vast and unfathomably deep map specifically for this DLC. Why would someone put this much effort into a DLC? The sign of someone doing their job well is how much care they put into even the smallest details. A company's quality is shown by how much freedom they give to their director because they know that, as long as they don't stifle the director's aesthetic concerns, they'll reap high profits from the game that director creates. Here, Miyazaki proves that he's someone who loves his job, someone who tries to push his creativity to its limits. His goal isn't to impress people with graphics. That's the aim of a simple, uncreative mind because good graphics appeal to casual players. When I was a kid, I was impressed by graphics because I was inexperienced and thoughtless. It's laughable and pitiful when veteran players who've spent years in the industry praise a game with bad gameplay just for its graphics. The portrait of a player who values graphics is a weak one, and I can prove this with the following argument. When such a player sees a game made with Unreal Engine 5 graphics, they'll be drawn in. But when they start playing, they quickly get bored, eventually quitting the game for good. However, by then the damage is done, their time has been poisoned. In contrast, a game with simple graphics but a philosophy behind it, or even without one, just something designed to offer the player unique experiences, could have opened the door to an incredible adventure. But the player got distracted by the beauty of the door next to it and deprived themselves of that experience. The person who went through the simple door ends up feeling much more satisfied and alive than the one who chose the flashy one. For example, if I recommended Outer Wilds to this type of player today, they would take one look at the graphics, turn their nose up, and keep refusing to play it, making a huge mistake. They wouldn't be able to see what space has to offer, fail to engage in solving the mysteries around them, unable to assemble the pieces of the puzzle, and thus miss out on the rewarding experience. They wouldn't be awed by the sight of massive chunks of shattered planets or watch with wonder as the sun goes supernova. But they'd have no problem playing Lords of the Fallen instead, saying, "Dude, the graphics look amazing. It's made with Unreal Engine 5. I have to play it." In doing so, they'd waste a couple of hours of their life for an experience that amounts to nothing. Aside from Elden Ring, previous Soulsborne games have often gone unnoticed by casual players due to their difficulty, gothic atmosphere, and comparatively lower graphic quality for their time. However, these games are built on the concept of challenge. In Soulsborne games, it's not the player with the best reflexes who wins. It's the one who perseveres the most and experiences the most satisfying journey. Let me give you an example from my own experience. I've completed Sekiro countless times, and because of that, I can now defeat most bosses on my first try. But I no longer feel the same level of satisfaction I did when I first started the game, because back then, it felt rewarding to finally overcome a boss after dying many times. When I think back to the hours I spent struggling to defeat Ishin, the Sword Saint, the final boss, I realized that the process of figuring him out was far more satisfying than defeating him in one try. To those players who shy away from these games due to their difficulty and are missing out on the experience, hear me out. The best players in these games aren't the ones with the fastest reflexes. They're the ones who persevere the most. Don't avoid these games just because you think your reflexes have dulled. Persevere and enjoy the reward that comes from the experience at the end. Besides, why are you bringing reflexes into this? Reflexes matter in competitive games, but here you don't need to be competitive or crush others. You just need 3 things: an average PC, determination, and patience. If these games were truly that difficult, people wouldn't be able to finish them while dancing. Don't listen to those who say, "Your reflexes are bad, just give up on this game," because they are the ones who don't understand the philosophy of Soulsborne. Their place is in League of Legends. Anyway, in a video where I'll dive deeper into the philosophy of Soulsborne, I'll be tearing apart those arrogant, toxic players. We can conclude that Shadow of the Erdtree feels more like a main game rather than just a DLC. Not only by looking at the variety of items, player agency, and atmosphere, but also by examining the dungeons, caves, and boss fights. These areas feel distinctly different from the main game. Even the exterior designs of the side areas show variety, not just the interiors. In the main game, there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy about the entrances of caves. They were quite plain. However, in this DLC, the entrances themselves are carefully crafted. It seems that Miyazaki may have thought the dungeon and cave entrances in the main game were too simple, so he adorned these new ones with more intricate details. For example, during my exploration, I stumbled upon a dungeon with its entrance blocked by broken barricades and its door shattered. Instantly, details about the possible backstory started forming in my mind, and I found myself asking questions like, what caused such chaos here? Were they searching for something only to meet their demise in the process? If what they were looking for is still inside, what could it be? How powerful is it? These questions show how much mystery has been amplified in this DLC. When I went inside, I realized that this wasn't just a dungeon, but an entirely different world. And this was only my first experience at the beginning of the DLC. I'm sure you're curious about the boss I encountered here. It was a premature creature. Since Shadow of the Erdtree is a DLC, it doesn't last as long as the main game. Its shorter length also means there are fewer side areas like caves and dungeons. However, this has allowed the developers to focus on designing them with much more detail and care, rather than being rushed or simplistic. For example, the interiors of these areas are more intricately designed, filled with brand new traps. Reaching the boss at the end of an area feels like solving a puzzle because you need to disable certain traps, open new paths, and find your way out of the labyrinth. Some caves can lead us to unexpected places. For instance, to access the fight against Bel the Dread, you first need to enter a specific cave. These kinds of side areas act as bridges to certain regions, and at the end, you don't just defeat a boss. Not every area ends with a boss. For example, instead of encountering bosses at the end of the ruined forges, which weren't in the main game, we find high-level upgrade materials. But of course, we can't simply grab them. We first need to solve spatial puzzles by activating certain mechanisms. After fully developing our character and becoming familiar with our build in the main game, we might ask ourselves, what more can we do in the DLC? Miyazaki seems to have anticipated this question, so he provides new opportunities for us to develop our characters in different ways. As we wander through this vast world, we will encounter many Scadutree fragments and revered spirit ashes. These are part of a new leveling system in the DLC. In exchange for a certain amount of Scadutree fragments, our attack damage and defense are permanently increased, while revered spirit ash boosts the damage and defense of our spirit summons and torrent. However, this mechanic only applies in the realm of Shadow. Using the Shadow Realm blessing system is crucial because at the start of the DLC, our blessing level is quite low, meaning bosses can one-shot us, and we can't deal any significant damage to them. We might initially think that our level isn't high enough for the DLC, but coming here at any level doesn't really change anything. For instance, when I entered the DLC with my character at level 150 after roughly 100 hours of gameplay, the first boss I encountered defeated me in just 3 hits. One reason for this was that my Shadow Realm blessing level was at 0. Another reason was that bosses level up alongside us, as the DLC has level scaling. The only way to deal with this is by raising our Shadow Realm blessing level. This mechanic essentially replaces the role of Estus and weapon and armor upgrades. I think adding such a system to the DLC is brilliant because it gives us a compelling reason to explore and engage with the world beyond just fighting bosses. These fragments can be obtained not only from the open world but also from boss fights. For example, the Golden Hippopotamus drops 2 fragments, and after overcoming such a tough boss fight, we gain plenty of fragments. Interestingly, the checkpoint system is better than in the main game. For instance, even near Lost Graces, it's possible to find Stake of Marikas. Typically, you'll find these 2 close to each other in areas with strong mobs. Sometimes, there's even a Lost Grace right next to a boss door instead of a Stake of Marika. In this way, the DLC improves upon the main game by being more efficient with our time. In the main game, the Spirit Springs weren't locked, but in the DLC, some are. To unlock them, we need to find hidden piles of stones or use specific items. By locking these, they've added an extra layer of difficulty to the game, making the experience a bit more challenging, though it's not a game-changing or critical mechanic. One issue I had with the main game was the dynamic weather system, and it has been partially addressed in this DLC. For example, over time, the weather shifts. It becomes foggy, storms brew, sometimes it's sunny, and at other times it rains. In the main game, rain and storms only occurred in specific areas. Another detail that makes this DLC feel like a second game is the questlines. There are about 14 in total, and you don't need to complete them all to finish the game. Completing the ones that lead to good boss fights is enough. Of course, you can also complete the non-boss quests to make boss battles easier or to deepen your lore knowledge. One interesting mechanic I don't recall being in the main game is this: if we interact with an NPC through a side quest, we can summon them for boss fights they have a grudge against. For example, Egon is burning with the flames of revenge against Bale. Thanks to the item he gives, we can summon him for the boss fight, leading to the epic moment I showed at the beginning of the video. We saw a similar mechanic in Lies of P, but in that game, the NPCs were little more than mimics that drew the boss's aggro without much additional purpose. What makes this mechanic different in the DLC is that you summon NPCs along with their storylines and motivations. In the main game, side quests allowed us to change the ending, but in the DLC, there is only one ending. This is likely because they wanted to tie up loose ends from the previous game and bring this story to a close. My favorite side quests were, of course, Egon and Emer. You can probably guess why I liked Egon. Emer satisfied me by giving clues, solving puzzles, and eventually leading to an interesting boss fight. The lore of Elden Ring deepens not only through the items in the DLC, but also through Miquella's footprints. These are referred to as Miquella's crosses and tell the story of his struggles. For instance, at the first cross we encounter, we learn that before embarking on his journey to become a god, Miquella left behind his doubts and hesitations. As we encounter more crosses, they gradually reveal how Miquella killed his emotions and desires, such as love, hate, and sorrow. As we follow Miquella's steps, we start to ask questions like, what was his purpose? Why was everything here burned and destroyed? Why do Hornsent and the others worship him? We will soon get the answers to these questions and more. I also realized in the DLC that I missed a few details in the main game. For instance, when I saw the horned characters, I was reminded of demons in Japanese culture. In that lore, the more horns a demon has, the more pain it endures. The number of horns increases based on the severity of the sins it has committed. In the world of Elden Ring, there were horned creatures who were cursed by Marika for rebelling against the Sacred Order, and they lived in the sewers of the lands between. This was a detail I missed on the lore side. Another detail I overlooked is related to gameplay. For example, when Torrent takes heavy damage, you fall off its back, and you have to use an Estus flask to summon it again. That part isn't the issue. The real problem is how the game asks for the flask. I've already signaled my intent by pressing the summon button, so why does it still ask me if I'm sure and require me to press yes? On top of that, why isn't the yes option pre-selected for practicality? If it were, I wouldn't have to waste precious time moving over to select yes in the heat of battle. In a game where milliseconds can make a huge difference, missing such a detail is quite frustrating. If Miyazaki did this intentionally, then we might just have to accept it as one of his notorious, rage-inducing design quirks. There's not much we can do except shrug it off. The previous game ended with many unanswered questions. We encountered certain enemy types, but we never faced their leaders. For example, we frequently encountered finger creepers, but we never got to fight their leaders. Miquella was mentioned often, yet we learned very little about him. It became clear that these elements were being saved for the DLC. They did something similar with Sekiro. For instance, we saw Tomo's name in many places, but we had very little information about her. Sekiro felt like it had a deeper lore that needed to be uncovered, but we couldn't fully grasp it. Perhaps they had planned to make a DLC for Sekiro, but it was scrapped due to Elden Ring. In this DLC, there are around 80 bosses, but only about 10 to 15 of them left a significant impression on me. These were the major bosses that were carefully crafted: Divine Beast Dancing Lion, Rellana, Mesmer the Impaler, Romina, and Midra. This doesn't mean that the others were poorly designed, though. It's just that going into great detail on the movesets of 80 bosses can truly drain a person and a company. It's sufficient to design bosses with fewer moves but with unique traits. For example, the Death Knight's moveset was relatively simple, but the fight was still enjoyable because of its unique behavior, unlike anything I'd seen before. Who could have imagined fighting a boss at the end of a cave that moves like the Flash? The Death Knight actually has two versions. One of them attacks us with dual axes, while the other wields a two-handed weapon. While they might look similar, they differ in terms of movesets and the synergy they create in battle. They share some common attacks, but a few small differences set them apart. The first boss fight, as in every Soulsborne game, was an educational one. This boss asks us to evade its attacks in different ways by switching between elements. It provides insight into the others as well. For example, although Dancing Lion has only one health bar, it has multiple phases. Depending on your playstyle, it may switch to the wind or ice phase, while at other times it might transition to the lightning phase. Not just in the main game, but also in previous Soulsborne titles, we don't encounter bosses that switch phases based on our playstyle. The bosses here would change their attack techniques depending on our position and actions. Such details prevented Soulsborne games from becoming rhythm games. The difficulty of Dancing Lion varies depending on your build. If you fight it with a high mobility but low defense build like mine, you'll defeat it fairly easily, but if you go up against it with a heavy build, you'll struggle a lot because it's a very fast boss. Another boss just as fast as it is Lana. Players of Dark Souls 3 would recognize how much she resembles Pontiff Sulivan, but she's not as difficult because, in the second phase, you have to fight Pontiff with his clone. This boss's second phase involves enchanting her weapons. The explosive flame traces she leaves where she strikes and the way she swings her weapons are also reminiscent of Abyss Watchers. This fight didn't impress me with its originality, but rather with its music and the noble stance of the boss. In the main game, we encountered finger creepers many times, but we never got to meet their leader. We get to experience this fight in the DLC, which remained a question mark in the main game. Miyazaki spares no torment for players in the Soulsborne games. The reason for this is his view of the world. To him, the world is a place filled with suffering, and in his view, humans need to find a way to cope with these pains. If we encounter dark atmospheres, intriguing characters, and events in the Soulsborne games, it's due to Miyazaki's life philosophy. Thanks to the boss named Mother of Fingers, the only thing left for him was to have us, the players, get slapped in the face by Thing, and he finally did that too. This fight was quite simple compared to others. Although her sudden movements were annoying given her size, it was still enjoyable to fight her. We can say that dragons aren't given much emphasis because throughout the game we mostly encounter ghost flame type dragons. Like in the previous game, they still have epic entrances. They differ from the main game in 3 ways: attacking camps, fighting each other, and new attack techniques added to their movesets. For example, wing attacks, the dragon stomping its foot on the ground to unleash elemental damage, and other techniques give us the feeling that the dragons are different, but we only encounter 3 different dragons in the game. The one we see the most is Ghost Flame, the other is Ancient, and the last one is a wyvern named Bale the Dread. In the DLC, I encountered a boss candidate who could be the King of Bears, something I wanted to see in the main game but never did. While wandering through the forest, a giant red bear appears, and we start fighting him. However, I can't say that this boss was meticulously designed because the limited number of techniques in his moveset made it easy to adapt to his patterns in a short time. Another boss without a fog gate but with the potential to surprise the player was this guy named Erdtree. We can say the same thing about him. He wasn't given much emphasis but could still surprise the player like the bear boss. They prove how much care they put into this DLC by designing around 20 bosses, countless locations, items with different characteristics, and lore details. I don't know about you, but the good impression they left on me and their exceeding my expectations allow me to overlook these somewhat hastily designed bosses. Elden Ring's DLC made me experience something for the first time. Despite completing Soulsborne games, especially Sekiro, multiple times, I never encountered a bug, but in the DLC I saw a boss glitch for the first time. For example, in my fight with the Death Knight, the boss just froze. Beating such a powerful warrior in such a simple way didn't feel right to me. I didn't get a satisfying experience from the struggle, so I had to fight him again. Have you ever wondered how players come up with such a variety of builds? All of their inspiration comes from the bosses, invaders, and other enemy types in the game. For example, if I were stranded on an island with no internet, and the only thing I had was a system to play Elden Ring, I would strive to recreate the build of the first invader I encountered. If the synergy is presented to me in this way, there's no doubt that I could make the same build or an improved version of it. These are essentially models that show us what we can do in the game. We don't just fight them. We also draw build inspirations from them. Since one of the things that makes Elden Ring special is becoming one with our build, there's no need to dwell on how important these inspirations are. In this DLC, we see a feature that wasn't in the main game but would have fit perfectly and significantly enhanced the liveliness of the open world. Now, large enemies, such as dragons and furnace golems, attack enemy camps. Not only do they fight the enemies there, but they also completely destroy their camps. Even dragons fight each other. This detail, which wasn't even in the main game, has been added to the Realm of Shadow and has made it a more lively open world than the lands between. Since the DLC is shorter compared to the main game, there's no repetitive feeling with the side bosses, which further fuels our desire to explore. Getting used to the boss's patterns was great, and they managed to put us in a flow state. However, the final boss, General Radon, is so absurdly difficult and unbalanced that we can't reach this state. Compared to all other bosses, General Radon is the hardest to defeat because he demands the most sacrifice from us. Through Prime Radon, Miyazaki seems to be sending us this message. You keep saying the bosses are hard, but in reality, they weren't because you fought them in their severely wounded states. If you had faced them in their prime, you would have said it's impossible to defeat them. So, instead of complaining about their difficulty, we should be grateful that we fight their wounded versions. Otherwise, we might lose what we have while asking for something better. Now, imagine fighting Melania in her prime. I suppose it would take us 5 days just to reach the second phase, and beating her might take a whole week. This distinction between prime and downfall periods is what enhances the boss's charisma. Radon, with both his downfall and prime periods, has proven himself to be the most charismatic boss in the Soulsborne series. But it's not just these details that increase his charisma. His moveset was also incredibly varied. The synergy he created by combining the magic he easily learned thanks to his mother's genes with the warrior skills inherited from his father proved that he was a legendary warrior. In the second phase, after Morgott, we see the strongest warrior of the lands between, with Miquella's hands wrapped around his neck. This divine, politically genius figure who is mentioned throughout the main game appears on the neck of Radon, the martial genius. Radon doesn't desire the throne for himself but for Miquella, as he has been resurrected and beguiled by him. Everyone who opposed him was killed by Miquella's followers. In fact, during the boss fight, if we get hit by Radon's grab attack twice in a row, Miquella doesn't care if we are tarnished. He seduces us anyway. I initially thought Melania was fighting Radon to save her brother, but the reason she wants to kill Radon is to send his soul to the Shadow Realm. Melania whispers in his ear, "O future consort, Miquella awaits you." Very few people, except a select few, could resist Miquella's charm. One of these rare individuals is Base Serpent Mesmer.
Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death. In the embrace of Mesmer's flame. Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death in the embrace of Mesmer's flame.
In the trailer, we see him as a villain, destroying and burning everything, but his real goal was to cut off Miquella's arms. That is, to eliminate the consort candidates, and to exterminate the Hornsent who defied his mother. Another name for Mesmer is Abyssal Serpent. He was born with a serpent, fused with it, and gained his immense power. It's not uncommon in the lands between to merge with divine creatures. For example, Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, fused with a serpent, the first Elden Lord Godfrey fused with a lion named Sirach, and Radon fused with Leonard. Here's an interesting lore detail. Leonard is not just Radon's friend, but also his guide. When we fight Prime Radon and reduce his health to 10%, he transforms into a meteor and falls. Without his companion, Radon would simply fall back to where he leaped from. But with Leonard's guidance, he manages to fall toward us. The bond between a good warrior and his steed is brilliantly showcased in this scene, as it allows him to execute such a meteor attack. While Radon garners attention for his difficulty, Bale stands out with his epic grandeur. When we fight Radon, our heart doesn't race, but the charisma of Bale, the scene where the magnificent dragon warrior Egon unleashes his fury, the music playing in the background, and when Bale enters the second phase, spreading his wings like a peacock revealing its feathers. All of this gives the player an unforgettable experience. The path leading up to this boss fight, with Bale's lair at the top of a lightning-filled mountain, and seeing dragon corpses as we ascend, makes us ponder what kind of creature we will face. It's a clever and artistic touch to convey the boss's power through the destruction they've wrought upon the environment. We understand Bale's terror from the path leading to him, and his charisma from the fact that he fights us while severely wounded. In Soulsborne games, fighting injured enemies has always felt strange to me because they try their best to survive. Normally, when players fight a tough boss, they feel like they're being treated unfairly. But the real unfairness is fighting a severely wounded boss over and over again. Believe me, you wouldn't want to be a boss in a Soulsborne game. Baal is a wyvern, a type of dragon, but unlike normal dragons, he is not quadrupedal. He is also not as massive as they are, but his smaller build has made him more agile. What sets Baal apart from other wyverns is his ability to use lightning, a trait of ancient dragons. Just as humans have diversified into races based on geographical conditions, dragons have also evolved into different types depending on their environment. Baal's power becomes even more impressive when we learn his lore. As we delve into his story, we discover that in addition to being called the Dread, he is also known as the Foul, the Harbinger of Destruction. Despite many injuries, he somehow managed to survive. When he betrayed the dragons and their lord Placidusax, he engaged in a great battle, decapitating the Dragon Lord's heads and inflicting severe damage on him. However, when he realized he could not defeat him, he fled, knowing that sooner or later someone would strike the final blow. And he was right in thinking so, because it is us who stop him from turning the lands between into a dragon empire. Placidusax sent his dragons after Baal the Dread, but we understand from the dragon corpses scattered around Jagged Peak that they failed. If they knew him, they surely wouldn't have pursued him. On one side were Placidusax's soldiers, and on the other, members of the dragon community never gave him peace. Yet, he was only trying to cope with the injustice done to him. He wanted to ensure that his kind was not looked down upon. If Baal had succeeded in killing Placidusax then and there, he wouldn't have been given the title the Dread, but instead the Dragon Lord. Yes, just like humans, dragons had splintered into subtypes and constantly waged war among themselves. Long before the Erdtree, dragons roamed these lands, but when humans set foot here, they began to vanish. Some, however, befriended humans. For instance, Godwyn the Golden once defeated Fortisax and made him his ally. We track Baal's trail by following the dragon corpses that had pursued him, and we eventually find him severely wounded. Baal, who paid the price for his foolishness by running away for so long, is now cornered with no place left to escape. Upon examining his body, we notice that, unlike normal wyverns, he has red eyes, and the horns and bones running from the top of his head down to his tail significantly enhance his regal appearance. Attached to his neck are two dragon heads that once belonged to Placidusax. When we first encounter the Dragon Lord, we question what happened to his missing heads, and when we see Baal the Dread and learn his lore through items, we piece the puzzle together ourselves. His wings have been ruined from battles with other dragons, but he can still use them. In fact, he uses the bone protruding from his right wing as a weapon, showing how far he's pushed his limits to survive. We can tell his left leg was torn off during a fight from the claw marks on his body, but even with one leg, he moves with remarkable agility. When he enters the second phase of the battle, he pushes himself even further and creates a brand new wing using elemental power. It's likely that when he realized he couldn't defeat Placidusax, he fled using these very wings. This indicates that he always had a backup plan. That's all I have to say about Baal the Dread. This is the story I've pieced together after checking the Elden Ring wiki. As for dragon hunter Egon, he's a brother who wanted to hunt Baal the Dread but never managed to, suffering greatly in the process. He is one of the Dragon Communion Warriors, a cult whose purpose is to feed on the hearts of the dragons they slay to harness their power. However, the backstory is once again tied to Placidusax and Baal, the one who betrayed him. In the beginning, their goal was only to hunt Baal and the dragons of his kind, but over time, they strayed from that goal and started hunting all dragons to gain even more power. This, in turn, made them more greedy. By doing so, they rebelled against Placidusax's divine law and turned into reptilian dragons themselves. Egon is an ambitious warrior like them, but this ambition has cost him dearly. He set his sights on a creature like Baal, but the moment he threw his first harpoon at him, he made the biggest mistake of his life. From that day on, Baal never stopped pursuing him, tormenting him endlessly, but Egon proved himself to be a good dragon hunter by evading Baal for a long time. He believed that feeding on the heart of Baal, who had caused him so much suffering, would finally end all his pain. But he was gravely mistaken because everyone who started feeding on dragon hearts met a terrible end. While it's not as action-packed as the area where Baal resides, Abyssal Woods also has its own unique atmosphere. When we first enter with our mount, even it gets scared and runs away, and it's a divine creature. We start to wonder what could possibly frighten such a being and continue to move forward in this place where even light seems afraid to venture. The questions racing through our minds aren't the only source of tension. The music playing in the background adds to the unsettling mood. On top of that, encountering a clue like, if it sees you, it's all over, don't draw its attention, only heightens the tension. Then we begin to understand the horror of the frenzied flame through the evolution of the mobs. If you ignore the hint the game gives you and try to wander around here as you would in other areas, you'll make a huge mistake, because at the slightest sound, you'll be taken down by an immortal enemy that appears right behind you and almost one-shots you. Their eyes are everywhere. If a frenzied flame-possessed rat sees you, so will they. The only way to avoid them, of course, is to use the stealth mechanic. The gameplay here isn't anything groundbreaking, but it leaves a strong impression because it makes us tense, and the atmosphere is much more terrifying compared to other regions. While sneaking through bushes lined with alarm-like plants can be tedious, at least it makes us think, well, they tried something new, and once we reach Midra's Manse, we are rewarded for our patience. The main game featured a cosmic deity called the Frenzied Flame, but instead of seeing it directly, we only saw its manifestations. Here, we still don't see it in person, but by fighting against Midra, the Frenzied Flame Lord, we get to witness the limits of its power. When we enter Midra's Manse, we are met with vast libraries, spirits, and chaos. We understand that this library is a tool for Midra in his attempt to become the Lord of Chaos, yet we also sense that it's no different from a stick stirring up a beehive, not only from the spatial details but also from Midra's screams. Atmospherically, the Manse was one of the most unique and impressive places. As a player who appreciates visual poetry, I can say that this place was deeply moving. Once you learn Midra's story, you'll understand that the details in this location are connected to his story and are not just decorative elements. The Frenzied Flame is also known as the Yellow Flame of Chaos. The souls of those who attempt to become the Lord of Chaos are consumed to the core by this flame. Those possessed by the Yellow Flame are called Followers of Chaos. Their goal is to awaken the Lord of the Yellow Flame and have it eradicate all injustices in this universe. If they succeed, no one will have to suffer for the sake of feeling good, and the external god known as the Greater will never have visited here in the first place, as it is the reason this injustice has emerged. We could liken the Frenzied Flame to Angra Mainyu in Zoroastrianism and the Greater Will to Ahura Mazda. One is evil, the other good. Just as the Greater Will's manifestation in the lands between is 2 fingers, the manifestation of chaos is 3 fingers. The chosen one of chaos becomes the Lord of the Yellow Flame and, together with it, aims to destroy the universe. Just as each would-be lord has a maiden, so too does the Lord of the Yellow Flame. Midra's maiden is his wife, Nanaya. She guides him along this path, giving him instructions, yet she doesn't teach him anything. He must reach the Frenzied Flame through his own inner journey. During this journey, things go far from expected, and the region where Midra resides is heavily damaged by the Frenzied Flame. It spreads everywhere like a virus, turning the area into a place feared even by sacred beings. Thanks to the horn scent, the damage was limited to just that area. To prevent the chaos within Midra from reawakening, they drove a giant sword into his body, punishing him with prolonged agony. The horn scent are the main cult of this DLC, also known as the Tower People. One of the reasons the lands of the Tower were burned and destroyed by Marika's son, Mesmer, is due to the horn scent and their strange rituals. Had they succeeded in these rituals, they would have rejected Marika's divinity and created a new god figure for themselves, which they indeed found by accepting Miquella's godhood. Mesmer waged his crusade to save religion, but he ultimately met a fate similar to Morgoth. Orders from his mother eventually ceased. Marika abandoned him, and he fell into depression. He imprisoned himself in a massive fortress called the Shadow Keep. He has no eyes, but the snake he's fused with serves as his vision. Like his sister Melina, he controls fire, but he dislikes it, as it reminds him of his own curse. I initially thought that in the main game, Mog was using Miquella, but thanks to the DLC, I realized that wasn't the case at all. In reality, Miquella used Mog as a means to reach the Shadow Realm. Why did he want to reach this place? Because here lies a massive gate known as the Gate of Divinity, which grants godhood to those who pass through it. For example, Marika, who once lived in a shaman village, passed through this gate, becoming the vessel for the Elden beast and starting a new age. Miquella, having passed through this gate, attained godhood, resurrected Radon, and made him his consort. If we hadn't defeated them there, he would have conquered the lands between with the army he assembled and initiated the so-called Age of Passion. Miquella embarked on this journey to make the lands between a better place, but the problem is that all tyrants who spill blood have claimed the same goal. Miquella's goal is not to bring peace to the lands between. He deceives people under the guise of goodness. The best weapon for conquering hearts is innocence. If you ask Rykard, he would also claim he's bringing good to the lands between, but none of them could ever be a Morgoth. In other words, everyone is driven by the desire for power. They have no genuine intention of protecting the lands between. If Miquella claimed not to bring goodness but to protect the lands between, preached unity, sought a mediator instead of a consort, and most importantly, set aside his divine aspirations to avoid causing strife, then true goodness might reign in the lands between. The most powerful ability in the Elden Ring universe is not gravity, blood, fire, or madness. It's the love. This ability is what makes Miquella the most terrifying creature because a person is defined by their heart, and when they give it to someone else, they lose themselves.
Aspiring Lord of the Old Order, if you have known sin, if you grieve for this world, then yield the path forward to us. To I, Miquella, and my promised consort, Radahn.
Miquella the Kind is a monster, pure and radiant. He wields love to shrive clean the hearts of men. There is nothing more terrifying.